is extremely warm 7,000 years ago. Then if we look at the 1,100-year cycles coming to today, each cycle is getting cooler and cooler and cooler. What we have to remember is we're 7,000 years removed already from the peak of the interglacial warm period. We're 7,000 years heading towards the next ice age. We're cooling down gradually here. And what we have today is not as warm as it was even 1,000 years ago. What we have are temperatures right now on the twin warm peaks of 1930s and now, perfectly normal. Perfectly normal for this type of cycle. There's no doubt about it. And as we slip into the global cooling cycle here, very shortly I talked about that cycle. And actually, if we skip to that other graphic that I have, the 230-year cycle, on the average, global cooling cycles come, or global warming cycles, either way, come every about 230 years. It can be as short as 200 years or as long as 240 years between cycles. We had a global warming cycle back in the 800s AD. Another global warming cycle back about 950 to 1050 AD. The Vikings settled Greenland in the 800s to 900s, because it was very much warmer back then than it is today. They settled there, and then they had to leave around 1100 AD as it slipped into a global cooling cycle. So anyway, I talked about a global warming cycle. They come about every 220, 30 years. Back around 800 AD, 1000 AD. Another one came in around 1310 AD. Twin temperature spikes in 1310 and 1380. That's 70 years between spikes. Remember, I talked about 72-year cycle. Then another global warming cycle back in 1500s. Twin temperature peaks in 1525, 1570. And that's only about 60 years between spikes. Then global warming cycle in the 1700s. That ended as we had global cooling, and then Tambora that really put a spike in it and caused the year of no summer. So these come just about every 230 years. Now, what I was showing on this particular graphic is when you start your global cooling, you're coming off a global warming cycle, and you start your global cooling cycle. Your next global cooling cycle typically begins 230 years after the previous global cooling cycle began, 230 years. So our last global cooling cycle began in the year 1790, right around 1790. What's 230 added on to 1790? The year 2020. So we're 230 years from the beginning of the last global cooling cycle. Then I also talked about that warm water pulse that went into the Arctic in 2008. What's 13 years removed from that? 2021. And actually the water would cool off a little bit before that. So we've got two cycles there, looking right at 2020, right around 2020, 2019, for the beginning of our real drastic global cooling cycle.
And are we ready for this as a planet? And how long will it last, though? That's another thing that I get a lot of people asking me, because there's some astrophysicists coming out showing that we're going to get a twin fall back in temperature. We're going to reach a bottom. We're going to spring up a tiny bit, and then we're going to fall back off in temperature. This is going to extend out until 2060 or so. I was just curious what you thought on the length of time as in the cooling before we start to see some respite and rebound in temperatures that'll bring our global agriculture back to, it won't be similar today because we're not going to get that warm again on this next cycle. I think this is a high peak that was anomalous anyway. But when can you see any respite and rebound into temperatures that would allow us to have global agriculture again to feed enough 8 billion people?
Well, the global cooling cycle we're going into, the worst part of it will be in the late 2020s through the 2040s to 2050s. And sometimes it takes as much as 50 years before you hit the bottom of it. Well, actually, the one that ended around 1570, that didn't bottom out until almost 1725. That was in the Little Ice Age. That took almost 120 years or so to bottom out. Normally, they bottom out about 50, 60 years. This one, I think this next one, when you look at the 230-year cycle one I have on here, you're seeing the same type of wavelength as you do on the 18.5-year lunar cycle, where you have the big peak on the left, big peak on the right, and smaller cycles in the middle. So my belief is that we won't go into the deepest global cooling cycle on this one. We'll have another global warming cycle after this, and then it will do the big bottom peak going into the next little ice age. So that may be 230 years away yet on really going down real bad. But this one will be a global cooling cycle. It'll go deep for about 50 years and then start recovering.
So the temperature drop in Celsius degrees, what kind of temperature drop would you expect with something like this? Over the next 50 years, are you thinking about half a degree drop, a 1C drop, 1.5, over the next 50 years? And I was just curious on that myself as a personal, comparatively to the research I've done, I'm trying to match up as many data points as I can because I'm always trying to learn new information every day as much as I can.
Well, instead of putting it in actual degrees, I want to put it into kind of a format people can relate to, and that's if they can remember how it was in the 1950s and 60s. I can. 50s and 60s were very cold here in the United States, very cold. We are now slipping into that. That's what we're going to see in the 2020s, is the same type of weather we had in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. And then we'll probably slip even a little bit colder to be more like what we were about 1850 to 1900. So that's colder. I don't believe we're going to get as bad as we were in 1816, where we had the year no summer, or if we do, it'll just be briefly with a big VMI 5-6 volcano. But it's not going to be as cold as it was in the 1400s and the 1600s. It's not the little ice age coming on this one. It's more like saying the temperatures in the 1950s and 60s, and also in the last half of the 1800s. So this is considerably colder than what we've had 15, 20 years. 1950s and 60s were very cold.
And I wonder how the global warming crowd is going to try to explain away all these consistently cooling temperatures. Okay, they can explain away one anomalous season as X factor, if you will, but when it happens for the second year and then the third year in a row, I wonder how many years this is going to take before people actually start to change their mind frame that it's something other than a trace gas that's causing these problems. And what point do people wake up and really start looking at the information that you've provided? And there's different cycles that drive, and we're just such a small planet here out from the sun and something that's 1 million times larger than us, and there's other celestial bodies outside of our solar system all connecting, and there's so much more effect to our planet than just us here with CO2. And I wonder how long it'll be before people notice that.
It'll take a number of years. One thing they're going to be seeing here once 2019, 2020 comes around, even this winter is going to be very cold, is there are going to be navigation problems in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes, and you get a lot of shipping in that area, and you freeze that area up and you have problems. They had problems back in the 60s and 70s in that area, and we're going to be back to that. If they have those problems up there for about 3-4 years, they're going to start thinking, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? It's going to take 3 to 4 years. Now, we could also get colder by the late 2020s, where there was a point back in, I think it was late 1800s, the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay froze over. Can you imagine that? So you'd even be disrupting navigation in the Chesapeake Bay area. You get about 4 bad winters in a row, and I think it'll be sunk in that, hey, okay, we have to change what we're talking about. But what's going to happen is they're going to flip the coin, twist it around, and they're going to start putting out research saying, oh, we were incorrect. Carbon dioxide actually causes cooling, is what they're going to say. They'll just flip it around to try to save face.
So going back to the cold winter again with disrupting shipping, 2013-14, they had to have additional icebreakers to bring the traffic through, and there were so many ships stuck out there, and they had to wait until the thaw to actually move those vessels around. If we're going to talk about even a cooler winter this winter coming up, And, that literature, I have already started to see that, not just drip-fed, but actually sprinkled in already with a sprinkler on high volume of these types of research papers coming out saying, it actually, global warming causes global cooling because it has all these other effects, X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, that are now causing cooling, and you're already starting to see that. Yeah, this year I would also imagine some delayed shipping into the Great Lakes ports as we saw back in 13-14 winter.
Oh, I'm sure we will, 2013-14. I'm looking for a similar winter to the 2014 winter. That was the winter, I believe, that caused the shipping problems in the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes. And it should be similar this year. Europe was warm, however, and I'm actually looking for Europe to possibly have a nasty winter. I was looking at their cycles, and they're within a year of having a cyclical, very nasty winter in Great Britain over through parts of Europe. And it could come as early as this year, and that will start to wake them up also.
Starting to see in the southern hemisphere, down in Australia, is supposed to be getting into warmer temperatures throughout Victoria, parts of New South Wales. They're getting record snowfall. The ski season has extended for the second year in a row. Tasmania snowed almost all the way down to the beaches. They got snow down to 100 meters, and this is September. Their average temperature is around 22 right now, and then also in Australia, in the south there, absolutely everybody's talking about how cold it is, yet the mainstream media comes out and said, it's a record warm winter, but literally the citizens are understanding with their own eyes that it was not a record warm winter, that it's still cold even this late in the season. So the southern hemisphere is starting to see this cooler pattern emerging. It seems like one step ahead of the northern hemisphere this year, like one season ahead of the cooling that's occurring in the north.
Well, that's right. They would be one season ahead because it's their winter down there. And that's a pretty good hint on what's going to happen up here. And I've already seen that in the high Arctic, how it's cooling down. So it is coming. And all of this is cyclical. And you wanted to talk briefly about hurricanes. And I would love to inject a couple of things on here because there's already media reports out there that article in today's paper of a senator saying, we have to stop climate change because it's causing all these nasty hurricanes. And I'd like to talk about this because it is very cyclical. This is one thing we do in our business at Global Weather Oscillations Incorporated. We developed climate pulse technology based on interactions of the Earth, Moon, Sun. And through this technology, we can track hurricane cycles. We can actually track individual hurricanes through time, from 1800s right up until now and 4 years into the future, through cycles, natural cycles. So what we've seen in the past occurs in the future, regardless of the temperatures. Because we've had very strong hurricanes. For example, in Florida, yes, they just had very strong Hurricane Irma. Well, it's really a Category 3. They had a Category 4 come in there in 1921 when it was very cold. Donna, Category 3, came in 1960 in sort of the same location. And there's been numerous large hurricanes, 4s and 5s, during the cold weather periods that have hit the area. So they occur in cycles. And I track the stronger cycles up through time is what I do. And I noticed this year, when I put out the press release in February for this year's hurricane outlook, preseason outlook, and first of all, I'd like to say here at Global Weather Oscillations, we've done this 10 years in a row. We've been correct 10 years in a row. Other organizations, leading organizations, which I won't mention their name, but it's organizations that the press turn to and they give them the headlines, they've been correct only about 30 to 40% of the time during the past 10 years. But they're the ones that get the headlines. Well, this year on our press release, our headline was the most dangerous and costliest hurricane season since 2004. We called for well above normal hurricane activity and 6 named storms landfalls for the United States. All the other preseason predictions when they first came out were calling for an average season, and no one else predicts landfalls. We're the only ones that do it because we're the only ones that have climate pulse technology. So we've been spot on. Texas, for example, typically goes through, historically since the 1800s, they've had about 7 quiet periods of no hurricanes. Their quiet periods typically go 8 to 10 years. Well, this year was year number 9. And we could see right on the Climate Pulse technology that they could very well break out of their quiet period this year, and we had it in the forecast. So what did they get? Hurricane Harvey. This year, Florida was in a quiet period. Florida has quiet periods that extend out 10 to 12 years. This year was year number 12. Last hurricane was in 2005. And we could see this right on our Climate Pulse technology. So this year, right in our zone forecast for South Florida, we predicted a Category 4 hurricane would make landfall in the South Peninsula of Florida and move northward. And Irma did. And we also, using the cycles, predicted the first hurricane in 25 years for New England. Well, right now, today, we have Hurricane Jose that's posed to possibly give Cape Cod hurricane force winds in a few days. So this is what we use, all cyclical data. We've seen strong hurricane cycles during periods of colder temperatures. Nothing to do, really, with climate change. Even the National Hurricane Center will not say anything about it. They agree that the hurricane cycles are cyclical, and the climate is not really making changes. No one's found any connection between global warming and the hurricane activity that's happened, or the strength of hurricanes, or the frequency of hurricanes. But it's showing up in newspaper articles, and some of these senators are starting to get on the bandwagon because they want to tie it into climate change. And this is something we have to get the word out to people that this is untrue. It's just the natural cycles.
I want to throw something a little strange at you, if I may. You're talking about cycles, and these exact dates rang something to me when you were talking here. I'm wondering if Al Gore and their PR staff knows about these same cycles, but they're keeping them hidden to themselves, because the release dates of both of their movies are falling on these exact cycles when there's going to be extreme weather that then they can claim that it's related to global warming. And it's just quirky that this year the new movie from their crew was released, and it's coming into this time when we're expecting tumultuous weather. If you're forecasting these hurricanes, maybe they're also working off the same cycles but not putting it out in the public. And then when we go back to 2006 and 2007, again, 2006, Inconvenient Truth, we're coming at that rate, same 1 year at the beginning of the year, extreme weather at that time too. So it's almost as if they're releasing these movies at these exact same times that you're also forecasting with extreme weather, hurricane landings, which then they can blame on CO2. Is it coincidental or is it purposeful?
Well, I really do believe that they're smarter than what we want to make them out to be. They know what's going on. It's all tied up in the politics and energy and their agendas. But they do know what's going on. It's just the character of the people that do anything to make money. I hate to say that, but that's pretty much what it is. They're going to stick to their agendas until they're made to stop. And the only way they're going to be made to stop is if we have 4 or 5 nasty cold winters in a row, and they're going to have to rethink a little bit. I think right now with their movies coming out and all, they're trying to milk it, knowing that the ending is coming. So they're milking it.
Yeah, but if you can predict with such accuracy with your hurricane forecasting like you've done, right on the money, when others aren't, there has to be something to this with the mathematics. And, you know, the ancient cultures across the planet all believed in cyclical time and cyclical patterns. And it just is part of our, human history that we know about cycles. We believe in cycles. All cultures in at least several thousand years ago believed in cycles. And then we come to today and somehow it's just linear time and there's no cycles involved. I just can't see how that's as being overlooked and missed with your accurate predictions and knowing what's coming forward with the cooling that we can talk about. And here, they're not even debating it in the media or even talking about it and telling people, you know what, this cycle's coming again, or it could come. Just like the hurricane, it could make landfall over here. You might want to get prepared. they're not even talking about it in the media. They're trying to rake you under the bus with your reputation and trying to stop the discourse right there because they don't really want this talked about. But if it's a possibility of these cycles happening, as we all know, at least they should talk about it in the media. So some people who would like to prepare, and that's the reason I want you to get your message out, is I actually know and believe what you're doing is the correct methodology to it. You are predicting the cycles through past cycles to forecast the future, and that is truly the way our climate moves. It's not what we add to it, it's cycles.
The thing is, any studies of natural cycles have been suppressed by the grant systems at the universities around the world. Since about the mid-1990s, most of the grants, almost entirely, have been for human-induced climate change. You could not get a grant to study natural cycles. I've had discussions with former heads of science departments in universities that could finally speak out because they're retired, and they said, no, when you apply for a grant, the grant's awarded in such a way that your results have to provide something towards the end result of what the grant wants, such as human-induced connection to climate change or something. So they could not get a grant to study what I'm studying here. The natural cycles are really studied by the private sector because the universities just can't do it. And because of that, the universities want to keep the natural cycle part of it quiet so that they can continue to get their grants to study human-induced global warming. It's their bread and butter. They know which side of the bread is buttered. Perfect example is I was scheduled to talk at an institute in Maine, state of Maine. And it was advertised by the Institute for over a month. And I told the Institute, I said, well, you do know that I'm going to be talking on natural cycles, right? I put it right up front because I didn't want any problems. And they said, yeah, that's okay. Well, 3 days before my talk, I noticed 3 people from the University of Maine on our website. The next morning, we received an email. My talk had been canceled. So there's a media outlet here in Maine that got a hold of the president of the institute and asked him what happened. And it was very curious, and he was honest, and he said, well, we had a call from the University of Maine, and they felt that some people in the audience would feel uncomfortable hearing what you have to say about natural cycles. So that was the University of Maine trying to protect their grant system and to really censor the other side.
When you talk about who gets airtime or also print time in major mainstream publications, it comes down to it's the same universities. Of course, they get the press releases with the new information that was supposedly found about global warming effect this or global warming effect that, and then it's all over the paper's front page because they're the ones that are supposedly pushing this agenda. But people like yourself, where's your airtime coming in comparatively? I mean, what percentage? Are you getting 1/110th of 1% of the press time or actually press space in a publication of what a university's findings would be compared to your hurricane forecast? Let's use that as an example. When you put out your press release for the hurricane forecast, calling and targeting and pinpointing what you did this year, how many publications nationwide picked that up and published you compared to what they did with, say, National Hurricane Center or something like this? Just pulling a name out of a hat here because these are just the ones that are every year. You hear their forecasts coming again and again, but they get front page every single time for a whole week. They're on every program. They make little videos to put it up inside, like Weather Channel and all these kind of things. But where were you in this whole, what was your total exposure compared to something like that?
Oh, 0.5% maybe. Do the press release, it gets online on the network, but not the media networks. It doesn't get publicized very much in the large publications. It does make it into insurance journals and into some smaller publications. It gets around and about, but it does not get any headlines as far as television, as far as the large newspapers. It goes to them, but they don't print it because it didn't come from the National Hurricane Center, NOAA, or Colorado State. Those two entities receive, as you just indicated, headlines for a week, interviews on TV and radio, just headlines. Well, Colorado State has only been correct 3 out of the past 10 years. The Hurricane Center has only been correct about 3 to 4 times out of the past 10 years. They were incorrect this year. Their first forecast this year called for a near normal season. 11 to 14 named storms, something like that. And then these entities, they update their forecasts every month. They update it again in June, July, August, September. You can't call it a preseason forecast anymore because the season begins June 1st. So by the time they issue their last forecast in August, they pretty much have it right by that time because the season is well peaked. And actually, I think the Hurricane Center just came out with one 2 weeks ago, upping their forecast to 16 to 19 named storms. But this was around September 1st. Now, when the season is over, they're probably going to say, well, we were correct because we had 16, 17 storms or something like that. They're going to say they were correct. Well, no. When you go back to May, when it's the preseason forecast, they were incorrect. And this is what I look at on the preseason forecast for verification. I look at all the forecast organizations out there, and the preseason forecast means preseason. That's a forecast before the season, not during the season.
The things that have gone on with temperature data manipulation coming out and the way that they do tweak data and try to erase warmer temperatures in the past to show a linear trend going forward. So the whole manipulation of data, it doesn't matter if it's from a forecast of hurricane seasons or actually temperature data. You can see that it's being manipulated and tweaked, the entire spectrum of what can be changed to show and fit a pattern of, hey, look at us, we're the experts, we always get it correct, and then the way that they've changed the past to reflect this current agenda of its global warming is continually warming comparatively. So you get into this whole gray area and kind of Alice in Wonderland type of, they seem to be still getting the headlines, although they're doing the manipulation, being caught every single year now, say since the last 3 years of manipulating something, red-handed, caught, yet they still get the headlines. So it makes no sense to me. It's got to be an agenda driving forward, or else they still wouldn't be getting such headlines, even after all the scandals. And not only the NOAA scandals, but what's happening down with the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. Their algorithms on their temperature stations were set that if it went below 10 degrees Celsius, anything below that wouldn't be registered. So let's say it went to 11.2 Celsius below zero, it would stop and peg at 10 C below. So you're missing the other, whatever it might have been, 10th of a degree or full degrees below that mark then. So then they can show that it's not really cooling. Jennifer Morrissey had noticed that the temperature station data that she had received live feed was quite different, and they had erased it and tried to change it, and they tried to cover it up, and they were caught, and it became a huge scandal. And you don't realize how many temperature stations, the entire network was done like this. And more people haven't woken up by now with all this information available on the internet. Why is everybody still keeping their heads in the sand?
Well, it's really the media. The media goes to their known sources. This has been talked about on some of the talk shows on television, and I agree with it that the media nowadays, because of the internet, the media is actually lazy. They do not do their own research to speak of. Instead, they just pass around what they've heard somewhere else, and most of what they've heard is incorrect. But they keep passing it around as being the truth. It's just laziness. A perfect example, and I'm sure you've heard about this, the 97% consensus by all scientists.
I have. Everybody has.
The Obama administration was flipping up that 97% rate up until the end, and I think you still hear it out there occasionally. But that came from John Cook at the University of Queensland in Australia. What he did, he looked at about 12,000 abstracts from papers that mentioned climate change. So he wanted to see what the abstracts said. Well, out of the 12,000 abstracts, about 33% of them said that human activity is the primary cause for climate change. Human activity. 33% of it. So what he did was he sent out a letter to the 33% saying, will you endorse human activity causing it? And 97% of the 33% wrote back endorsing it. That's where the 97% came from. It's 97% of 33%. Where in actuality, the other 8,000 papers, research papers, had no opinion on climate change or found no connection to human activity. But they're still throwing out 97%. Now, Dr. John Coleman, founder of the Weather Channel, he did his own poll, and what he found was 15% of meteorologists say that climate change is mostly human-induced. That's only 15%. 85% said it was mainly natural cycles, maybe some human activity in there, but mainly natural cycles. But that 97% keeps getting thrown out, and the people in the government are still throwing out because they don't know the truth. It's a hearsay, and they're not doing the research to find out the truth, and the media is not doing the research to find the truth either.
Yeah, so I did look into John's work. I actually did a video on that. And the thing for me was also, there was no big headline coverage on that, where we keep routinely seeing still the 97% in large publications. But his brand new research citing the 15% and that all that work he did and amazing graphs and charts and all the meteorologists that he interviewed, that still didn't make even 1/5 of 1/8 of a percent of the news that the regular 97% still makes throughout. It's just, it's a biased agenda we're pushed into still to this day, and that's why I'm so happy. We had a chance to talk tonight, so you can bring out some of your ideas here. And leaving on that, because we could continue to talk for hours and hours about this, but is there any last couple things you'd like to talk about here? The floor is open for you.
Well, my biggest thought is we need to get the word out on natural cycles. That's the big word to get out. Our climate pulse technology pinpoints much of what's going on. Climate change is definitely cyclical. We're definitely heading into a global cooling cycle, dangerous global cooling cycle, especially having 7 billion people on Earth now. We also need to get the correct word out there, get the facts out, so that people understand the facts, and we need to override all the false narrative that's out there. So that's the main thing I'd like to say is we just need to make a lot of changes here to educate people. And this is what I'm trying to do when I'm interviewed. I'm trying to educate people when I do talks, do my webinars. It's to educate people for the truth. I just want people to come to my videos, to the website, learn the truth, and prepare for the future, which is global cooling.
And I do want to thank you so much for spending your valuable time listening to our conversation, talking about some new ideas and cycles, and staying on this very same idea of cycles driving the climate system on our planet. Please join me for my next episode of Mini Ice Age Conversations, where I'm talking with Peter Temple of the World Cycles Institute. Futurist, market analyst, helping executives and entrepreneurs understand cycles and how they affect the economy, specifically business and agriculture. I'll see you next time.